Israel is known for its innovative approach to pretty much anything it does. This is particularly true when it comes to water, as the country's geography doesn't give it many options. The water supply network, made up of miles of pipes, channels, tunnels, and reservoirs, along with stations that handle water purification. Israel has all of this because there's no other way to manage it. And while water is an incredibly valuable resource, Israel constantly pours huge amounts of it into the desert. Of course, the country isn't planning to create a humanitarian crisis by wasting precious water for nothing. Things are much more interesting than that. Let's try to figure out what's really going on here. This is the Israeli Negev desert, the conditions. There are pretty similar to those in other harsh deserts around the world. The average daily maximum temperature throughout the year varies from 88 degrees Fahrenheit to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Depending on the part of the desert, the average daily minimum ranges from 66 degrees Fahrenheit to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. However, at certain times in the Negev, it gets so hot that it's almost unbearable to be there. In the summer months, the temperature can reach almost 122 degrees Fahrenheit. What about the precipitation? Well, it's a typical desert, so there's practically none in the southern part of the Negev desert. The situation's especially bleak in summer. There's traditionally no precipitation at all, and during the rest of the year, the total doesn't exceed 2 inches. On average, only about 0.9 inches of rain falls annually in the northern part. Things are a bit better in the summer. Nothing falls from the sky either, but at other times of the year, rainfall can reach up to 1.6 to 2 in, which is incredibly high for this region. The annual average in this part of the Negev is over 8 in, for comparison. The Sahara Desert gets about 4 in of rain a year, so the northern Negev has it somewhat lucky. As for the desert's terrain, it's mostly sandy dunes, some of which can reach up to 100 feet high, along with rocky dusty mountains and deep craters. There's also sparse vegetation, trying to be a bit more diverse with small bushes and occasional short trees. Do you know what's the worst thing about the Negev desert for Israel? So let's take a look. The country's total area is only about 8,100 square miles. That's really small. To be more specific, Israel ranks 148th in terms of land area in the world. Meanwhile, the Negev desert covers a staggering 5,000 square miles. That means this sandy, rocky area with limited vegetation takes up more than half of the country's total land. In this situation, Israel definitely needed to come up with something to make use of the land that, under normal circumstances, wouldn't be good for anything useful. David Banan, a very significant figure in Israel's history, kept saying that the Negev needed to be developed. He didn't live to see the radical changes, but eventually the desert started to literally transform. This wouldn't have been possible if the country hadn't begun supplying the desert areas with enormous amounts of water. In particular, the Israelis began providing the Negev with water through their national water supply system. The main task of the project, completed in 1964, was to pump water from Israel's most important reservoir, the Sea of Galilee, to the densely populated center and dry south of the country. For this, a system was created with a total length of about 80 miles, consisting of giant pipes, open channels, tunnels, reservoirs, and large pumping stations, capable of pumping up to 19 million gallons every hour, or 449 million gallons of water per day. At first, it might seem like the system isn't really supplying water to the Negev. The pipeline only runs through the western part of the desert, however. That's just the main pipeline. There are plenty of secondary branches. These go further into the desert, reaching places like Be'er-Sheva, a city with over 200,000 people. By the way, it's one of the top 10 most populated cities in the country. Yes, hundreds of thousands of people live in the desert city of Israel. It's a great indicator of how well-developed the water supply system is, and how it helps forget that the house is somewhere among the desert dunes, where only some camels and nomads could survive. This is how water was supplied to the desert until the Sea of Galilee freshwater reservoir was hit by a drought. The freshwater resource levels were constantly monitored, and the solution was to rely on desalination plants. You can see them here on the map, along with the national water system. Their capacity starts at 23 billion gallons of desalinated water and reaches 39 billion gallons island at the most advanced station called Sorek. As a result, the Israelis connected each of the stations to the main water system through infrastructure worth $250 million. The Sea of Galilee began to be replenished with water from the Mediterranean Sea when the dry south, meaning the Negev Desert, started to be filled with hundreds of millions of gallons of water that had been completely unusable not long ago. By the way, Israel's main water supply system is not just a piece of infrastructure on a massive scale, but also an effective solution. Water losses are only 3% to compare in the UK. This figure reaches 20% in Bulgaria. It's 20%, 50%, and in Romania, it's 70%. So practically every gallon of water from the Mediterranean Sea that's desalinated is used to its full potential. The NGV also gets its water from underground, specifically from the mountain aquifer. It's safe. Yield, meaning the amount of water that can be taken out without harm, is about 95 billion gallons per year. However, Israel as a whole doesn't have a lot of water resources, and they even less, which is why, as of 2023, twice as much was being pumped out of the aquifer, about 158 billion gallons of water. Let's put it this way. Pumping a lot of water out of aquifers is generally very risky because they don't have enough time to replenish and could be completely drained, especially in Israel's climate. But there's another issue with underground water sources. Right beneath them lies a body of salt water which could contaminate the freshwater in the aquifer. Because of this, the country and the Negev Desert will increasingly focus on high-tech desalination instead of pumping water. This will help improve the security of the underground water source, and the last water source supplying Israel in the Negev Desert is already used. Water starting from the 2000s, the country's invested more than $750 million in this field, creating 67 large processing plants, 10 of which recycle over 56% of the country's wastewater. Just imagine 87% of all the water Israelis drain into the sewer system is then turned into something that can be used again. That's pretty impressive compared to, say, the US. There, this figure doesn't even reach 10%. The main reclamation system in Israel is She'an, located in the Tel Aviv area. It treats about 97 million gallons of wastewater a day, some of which then flows to the Negev. The treated water is pumped through a pipeline to irrigate 60% of the greenery in this harsh desert region. And here, we finally come to what Israel has partially managed to turn its dry southern territory into. To start with, it's important to note that desalinated underground and sewage water played a major role in creating a forest. Yep, you read that, right? Part of the arid Israeli desert was transformed into a green space where trees now grow. This is the Yair Forest, located in the northern part of the Negev Desert, and it covers an area of 11 square miles. And this is actually a record. It's the biggest forest ever planted in Israel. The total number of trees the Israelis have planted in this area reaches an incredible 4 million. If they hadn't greened the area this way, it would only be home to low bushes like Jerusalem sage and hairy breadgrass. But now it's a forest that's 90% Aleppo pine. But you know, the truth is that planting pines and other trees here wasn't just for beauty or to make people feel confused. like a coniferous forest at the edge of the desert, what Yair was planted for a much bigger and more important goal: to stop the spread of the desert, and it's working. It was planted 60 years ago, and it's still here, green fresh, and stopping the sands of the Negev desert from spreading further. Also, the forest is literally an impassable wall for carbon in the air, meaning the trees act as a sort of trap. For over 15 years, research has been conducted here showing that Yair absorbs an astonishing amount of the universally hated carbon, as much as forests in wetter regions. This is where their service still doesn't end, because Yair is the reason why rare local rainfall evaporates less. The trees block the sun, so the rays don't reach the water. Of course, people in advanced Israel couldn't help but use the forest for research as well. For example, Yair is part of the NASA FluxNet project, a global network of micro-meteorological towers used to measure the exchange of carbon dioxide, water vapor, and energy between land ecosystems in the atmosphere. The Arava Institute for Environmental Studies is also operating here, focusing on crops like dates and grapes that are grown in the vicinity of the Yair forest. Why these studies are part of a project to bring new crops to dry and salty regions. However, of course, there are certain problems. For example, if the forest has been growing here for 60 years, that doesn't mean it's been completely loss-free. Scientists have found that 5 to 10% of the forest dried up and died due to a series of extreme droughts over the past decade. Moreover, the forest is not recovering due to ongoing climate issues, as well as the grazing of sheep and goats, which are always eager to eat young pine saplings. Another problem is based on a simple truth. A tree, no matter how good it is, isn't always a good thing. The area where Yair was planted has never been a forest, so the local species are adapted to shrubs they need. Open landscapes to dive after their prey, plus heavy machinery and herbicides used when planting trees are probably not great news for the fragile soil of drylands, because its crust gets destroyed, and there are small plants, lions, mushrooms, they're food for insects, reptiles, and birds. So you get the idea, everything has its downsides. What other reason does the Negev have to show off? For example, its agriculture is doing really well, though actually agriculture is pretty much developed all over Israel. Israel is one of the most efficient producers of cow's milk, 3,430 gallons per cow, compared to 2,640 gallons in North America and 1,580 gallons in Europe. The tomato yield in Israel is 300 tons per 2.4 acres, compared to the global average of 50 tons per 2.4 acres. The country also produces 262 tons of citrus per 2.4 acres, compared to 243 tons in North America and 21 tons in Europe in the Negev. Farmers also grow sunflowers, wheat, melons, chickpeas, pomegranates, almonds, and olives. All right? If that doesn't surprise you, they even managed to grow cotton in the desert, one of the most water-hungry crops you can plant. There are even some figures provided by the farmers of Saberkay. In good years, they managed to harvest 3.5 tons of sunflowers, 7 tons of wheat, and 6.5 tons of cotton. Doesn't sound like a lot. We're talking about yield per 2.4 acres. So, these are actually pretty decent numbers. Here's the total value of fruit production in different countries. It's like GDP, but just for agriculture. So Israel's in first place, followed by Pakistan, Portugal, New Zealand. And this is despite the fact that these countries have much larger land areas than Israel. All the other countries on the list are also bigger. But the total area is one thing. Israel is a country where more than half of its territory is covered by the Negev desert, dry, harsh, and all that. However, it's this southern desert that makes up 40% of the country's entire agriculture. How do the Israelis pull it off? By now, You figured out that the country has a sophisticated water system which delivers desalinated water from the Mediterranean Sea to the Neve. They also use underground water for agriculture. And let's not forget about wastewater. It's turned into something usable for the field. So it's sent to the farmers. But if the water were just taken and poured into a dry desert, the consumption would be gigantic. No system, even Israel, could handle such a task. Innovations and agriculture help save water. The most important one is, of course, drip irrigation, which started gaining widespread use in Israel since the 1950s, thanks to one of the founders of MECAT, the country's main water organization. What's the idea behind this method? In this case, it's not just about flooding all the beds with water, the liquids. Supply directly to the root zone of the plants in small portions, with the regulators being the drip dispensers. This kind of irrigation brings a lot of benefits, like lower water usage, reduced erosion, weed growth, and much more. Of course, there's one downside: higher cost compared to traditional irrigation methods. However, in the case of farming in the Negev, this drawback isn't a big deal at the very least, because thanks to drip irrigation, the country feeds itself and earns money from exports. And at most, it also involves fish farming, which just as much brings in money and feeds the population. Yes, they really grow fish in the desert. A few decades back, scientists found that in certain spots under aid lands, 50 to 100 feet below the surface, there's water at 104 degrees Fahrenheit with low salt content. Thousands of years ago, the desert was, in this case, it's not just about flooding. Much wetter rain fell from the sky, and the water soaked into the ground, gathered and warmed up. Then scientists showed that this water makes an ideal environment for species like tilapia, bream, Baram catfish, guppies clownish, and many more. The fish isn't just raised for food, it's released into the water where it releases metabolites that are very nutritious for plants. The enriched water can then be used to grow crops over its lifetime. Plants absorb the metabolites through their roots, essentially cleaning the water, and it returns to almost its original state. In short, a closed-loop system, a commercial fish farm in the Negev desert with a production capacity of 2,000 tons of barramundi per year. It's located on an 86-acre plot above a geothermal water source with a temperature of 98 degrees Fahrenheit. The water's pumped into internal systems, then used to grow barramundi, and a small amount of water is discharged beyond the site, thus starting its role in agriculture. With the help of a special system, the water is reused for irrigation of nearby olive groves. Now, let's remember David Ben-Gurion again. He hoped that the lower desert part of the country would eventually help the north in terms of desalination and renewable energy. As for desalination, the south really does contribute because they've already studied how such water can be used in aid areas. Moreover, Bingwan probably didn't suspect that the technologies of Israel would be used by the whole world. But what about energy? The Negev desert helps out here because it gets a huge amount of sunlight and has vast used land, perfect for implementing projects related to solar energy. And here's one of the main examples: the Ashim power plant, located south of the most populated city in the Negev Desert Bay, or Chiva. It consists of 3 sections, each with a different technology. The first is a parabolic trough plant with a capacity of 121 megawatt. There are numerous reflectors here that concentrate sunlight onto a pipe with a heat transfer fluid. The thermal energy in this system can be stored for up to 4.5 hours on the second site. There are 50,600 of these objects, heliostats, which focus sunlight on a collector tower. Each one automatically adjusts the position of the sun to reflect the optimal amount of sunlight, which is why the output reaches 320 gigawatt hours of energy per year, and now it's time for records. Until recently, this tower, standing 853 feet tall, was the tallest in the world of its kind. Although this probably doesn't matter much to those living nearby and the farmers working in the fields. For them, there's a much more important fact: the station produces 320 gigawatt hours of energy annually, enough to power 120,000 homes and provide a lot of energy for agricultural needs. The third site is a photovoltaic station, which doesn't really stand out in terms of figures compared to its counterparts, having a capacity of just 30 megawatt. However, it serves as an additional source of energy, both for the residents and for greening the Negev desert. Yes, and Guan kind of looked into the future when he said the NGV would be a test of Israel's creative potential and innovative energy. He didn't know how well Israel would do on that test. But now we can say, for sure, the country is handling it well